Hello, my name is Dr. Ana Afzali. I have been a professor of Spanish for 25 years. As a researcher and as a historian, one of the things that has always baffled me is how the Camino de Santiago has basically survived over the centuries. Generally speaking, in history, things are born, they increase in popularity, and eventually die down. The Camino de Santiago, or the Way of St. James, has been in existence for over 1,200 years, and its popularity and the way it's walked is just as strong today as it was 1,200 years ago when it started. The symbol of the Camino de Santiago is this scalloped seashell. This is something we're going to be talking about later on in our lecture today. So oftentimes when you see pilgrims walking the Camino, you will see them walking with a seashell attached to their backpacks or their hat or their clothing. We will talk about its history and how it came to be. Here's a picture of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, which looks quite different today from when it was built in 1075. We will talk in our other lecture about the different cathedrals that were built to venerate the relics of the Apostle St. James, which from now on will be named in its Spanish name Santiago or Santiago de Compostela. Let's talk about the things that have hurt the Camino de Santiago over the centuries. In the 14th century, black fever invades Europe and hundreds of thousands of people die. The pilgrimage at that point was reduced to a bare minimum. Of course, there were fewer people in the continent to travel to Santiago, but also those who remained needed to tend to the animals, to the farms, battle in different wars, so there were less people available to travel to the Camino de Santiago. During the rise of the Protestant Church in the 16th century, Martin Luther declares that what is buried in Santiago de Compostela is not the remains of the apostle, but rather those of a dog or a horse, and strongly discourages people from traveling to Santiago. Of course, there were thieves that took advantage of the rights that the pilgrims have. We're going to be talking at length about the rights that the pilgrims have in our other lecture. But suffice to say here that in the 17th century, Felipe II signs a decree whereby he forbids commoners from dressing with the pilgrim outfit unless they were actually walking the Camino. Let's talk about Francis Drake too. Francis Drake, who lived from 1543 to 1596, was a very famous and fierce pirate. He was British. And we have the Archbishop at the time, Santiago de Compostela, was worried about his threats. Francis Drake had basically threatened with invading La Coruña, which was a city nearby, and later on Santiago de Compostela, and he had threatened with burning the cathedral and stealing the remains of Santiago de Compostela. So the Archbishop, Don Juan de San Clemente y Torquemada, who was Archbishop from 1587 to 1602, and given the threat of Francis Drake, decides to hide the remains of Santiago. The problem is that when he hides the remains of Santiago, he goes to the grave without telling anybody where he had hidden those remains. So needless to say, there was a long period of time whereby the popularity of the Camino had decreased given the fact that nobody knew where the remains had been hidden. But how did it all begin? A Christian hermit named Pelayo or Payo, 9th century, in the first third of the 9th century, sees some lights in the sky, and when he follows those lights, he finds a grave. Immediately when he finds that grave, he goes and looks for Teodomiro, who was then the bishop of Iria Flavia, near Santiago de Compostela. When Teodomiro goes there, he immediately declares he has found the remains of one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, Santiago. How did Teodomiro know that this was indeed Santiago? Well, because there were rumors that Santiago had been preaching in Spain. It was said that after he had preached in Jerusalem, after the death of Jesus, he had come to Spain and preached there. Santiago was Juan's brother, and they were both among the first to follow Jesus' call. And we're going to be talking in our next lecture a lot more about the preaching of Santiago in Spain and its documentation. The reality is, however, that there is a very large possibility that he indeed did not preach in Spain. Among other things, primitive Christianity contemplates a debate. On the one hand, there was that group of those who believed that the message of Christ was for the Jewish population and not for the general population. After all, Jesus was Jewish. There was another group headed by Pablo Tarso who believed that the word of Jesus needed to be spread for everyone. Santiago, however, belonged to the first group. It is also important to know that there were no Christian settlements in Galicia until the 3rd century. Here's a Celtic settlement in Galicia from around that time. This is at the top of the Montaña de Santa Tecla, or Mountain of Santa Tecla. Let's talk a little bit more about the Apostle St. James. When the Virgin Mary sees that her death is coming, she basically receives a visit from her resurrected son, and she tells him that she does not want to die alone. And she's worried because all the apostles are all over the world preaching and not next to her. And so Jesus basically helps Mary to appear to the apostles so that she can let them know that she wants them to come back to be with her. And so she appears to Santiago, who supposedly, according to the legend, was in Spain at the time. And she appears to him on top of a marble pillar. And now she's called the Virgin of the Pillar, or La Virgen del Pilar. And that relic is, that pillar supposedly is in Zaragoza in Spain. So Santiago follows the petition of the Virgin Mary and returns to Palestine, to Jerusalem. And it is there that Herod Agrippa, who was then the emperor at the time, and here's a picture of a statue of Herod Agrippa, as well as a drawing from one of his coins. And it is there that he is arrested, and martyrs at the time were killed by cutting their head. So he was decapitated in the year 44. Well, the legend continues, and the legend says that after he dies, his two followers, Teodomiro and Atanasio, put his body in a boat, and basically the boat comes down through the Mediterranean and into the stretch of Gibraltar and up the coast of Portugal and into Galicia in the northwestern part of Spain, where he is finally buried. Let's talk for a moment about the columns of Hercules, or the stretch of Gibraltar at the time was called the columns of Hercules. Here's a statue of it in the upper right side. And it was believed that the end of the world was basically there at the time. In fact, the Spanish seal today, as you can see it in the bottom right, has the two columns on this side, which are supposed to be the columns of Hercules. If you see in the ribbon, it says plus ultra. Plus ultra in Latin means beyond there. Why? Before Columbus came to America, the seal, the Spanish seal, actually had that ribbon, and it said non plus ultra, because it was believed that there was nothing past that part of the world. And then after Columbus discovered America, the word non was taken out, and it just says plus ultra. It is said that the dollar symbol comes from those two columns with the ribbon around it. In any case, he was basically buried in Santiago de Compostela. In the Spain of the 9th century, there was a huge need, however, for an icon. Let's remember that the Muslims had invaded Spain in 711, and they were just hanging on as well as they could in northern Spain so that they could start reconquering the peninsula. So, for instance, in 997, the troops of Almanzor came up through Portugal, And along their way, they were killing people, burning churches, etc., etc. And it was said that every time they went by a convent or a monastery or church, they would steal the bells so that they could use them for their mosque down south. Well, when they arrived in Santiago de Compostela, they did the same thing. They burned the city completely. They burned the church, but Almanzor was very careful to respect the remains of Santiago. It was said that Muslims always respected other people's relics and saints, etc. As a matter of fact, legend has it that there was an old man sitting by the grave of Santiago, and that he spared his life because he realized that the only reason why he was there was to honor the remains of Santiago, and so he did not touch him. Legend has it also that the bells were brought down to Cordoba, and they were carried by Christian prisoners. And 2.5 centuries later, the Christians, as they won many battles and had pushed the Muslims out of most of the Iberian Peninsula, had Muslim prisoners carry those bells back to Santiago de Compostela. When they were carried back, the metal from those bells, which had been used, by the way, in the Mosque of Cordoba for those 2.5 centuries to light up the mosque, when they were brought back to Santiago, they were basically burned and molded into one bell that was used in the clock tower of the cathedral, which was eventually replaced since the original one was cracked and can now be seen in the museum of the cathedral. So basically, Christians were in need of an icon so that they could fight back the troops, the Muslim troops that were just horrid. They were oftentimes said that the Christians thought this was Armageddon, this was the apocalypse, this was the end of the world, because the incursions of the Muslims were just so brutal and so deadly to the Christians. So, of course, when they found the remains of Santiago, this was perfect because this is exactly the icon that Christians needed to fight back against the Moors. So Al-Andalus had its borders very far up in the peninsula, and the Christians found a good icon in Santiago de Compostela. So when King Alfonso II, king of Asturias and of that whole region, was told that the remains of Santiago had been found, he goes there immediately. And then he realizes that he has an amazing opportunity to connect his small kingdom with the rest of the Christian world and, of course, with the rest of Europe. And he also sees benefits for its political and economic interests. So, of course, he immediately declares that, yes, these are the remains of Santiago. Here's a statue of King Alfonso II, which is located next to the Cathedral of Oviedo, which is the province of Asturias today. I had the honor of visiting this statue last year when I was in Asturias. I wanted to show you a map exactly showing where Asturias is. And this region, it's considered to be really the most Spanish of them all because it was truly the only region that was not conquered by the Muslims, who, if you recall, the Muslims were in Spain from the year 711 until 1492, when they were finally expelled completely by King Isabel and King Ferdinand from Granada in southern Spain. So today we have an award called Princesa de Asturias or Príncipe de Asturias, which is really the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in Europe. And here's a picture down below of the ceremony. And every year we give an award for literature, another one for science, et cetera, just like the Nobel Prize does. And it's granted, it used to be granted by now King Felipe when he was Prince of Asturias. So whoever the prince or the princess is in Spain has that title, Prince of Asturias or Princess of Asturias. So now we have Princess Leonor, and so she is the Princess of Asturias. And here's a picture of the ceremony. The Middle Age is basically a time of relics, And they all, of course, had categories of importance. And churches competed for the best relic, and which could be better than the body of Santiago, one of Jesus's apostle. And so then it becomes the ideal relic, the standard for fighting Muslims. And the legend of Santiago Matamoros is born. How did that happen? Santiago Matamoros. Matamoros means Moorish killer, which is not a very politically correct term today, but that's what it was called at the time, right? So let's talk about the Battle of Clavijo for just a moment. In the Battle of Clavijo, which took place in the year 844 on May 23rd, King Ramiro I had basically refused to pay the tribute of the 100 doncellas to the Muslims. And so, of course, the Muslims started fighting the king, and they get into this huge, huge battle. And King Ramiro sees that he's a lost cause, that they're completely surrounded by Moors, that they're going to die, that there's really nothing that they can do. Abderrahman II is about to win over the battle and probably kill all of them. And it is at that time when supposedly the legend says that a figure of Apostle St. James or Santiago appears riding a white horse. Here's a statue of him. And here's a painting of the same. You see the scallop shell and his outfit as well. So basically, the Apostle St. James appears to him and says, "Do not despair. You're going to win this battle. I'm going to help you here and from now on. Yours is a saint cause, and your victory, it's a sure thing." And so it was said that he won that battle, and that from then on, Santiago Matamoros would appear oftentimes in different battles, helping the Christians win against the Moors. So at that point, Christians had been just holding on in the Kingdom of Asturias for about 300 years, just barely making it. And then when the legend of Santiago takes root in about 50 years, they really push the border down south in the peninsula, down to Toledo, and things start looking really, really great. So definitely the appearance and the rise of the legend of Santiago had helped the Christians get the motivation that they needed in order to fight the Moors. There was a great deal of hardship at the time in the Middle Ages. And so that hardship, along with the invasion of the Moors, had given rise to the cult of Santiago. So people needed some inspiration to battle every day, the hardship of their daily lives, the hardship that they were dealing with the Moors. And so Santiago was just like giving somebody a glass of water in the middle of the desert. It was just exactly what they needed at the time. Christians basically viewed the Muslim invasion as a punishment from God. In fact, legend has it that Rodrigo, the last Visigothic king, lost the Battle of Guadalupe. Some said that his body was never found. Others say that he basically just retreated to the town of Toledo to strategize. When he was in Toledo, he was in the church and he opened a trunk that he was not supposed to open. He had been told by God, "Do not open this," but he defied what he was told and opened it anyway. And that when he opened it, he basically saw a painting with a few men dressed in a Muslim attire. And Don Rodrigo, it's been said, to pay for his sin, locks himself in the trunk and is eaten by a snake. And so Christians were seeing the invasion of the Muslims as a punishment from God. But let's talk really about what is more likely to have happened. The truth is that Rodrigo had basically raped the daughter of Count Julian. And Count Julian was in charge of defending Ceuta, which is the area in southern or northern Africa, southern Spain. And so he was in charge of guarding that post so that Muslims could not enter the peninsula. So when the king rapes Count Julian's daughter. He basically decides to show his revenge by allowing the Muslims to invade the Iberian Peninsula, which of course proved to be just a catastrophic thing for the Iberian Peninsula. And so when the body of Santiago is found by Christians, Christians basically saw it as a forgiveness from God. Again, it had been seen as a the invasion of the Muslims had been viewed by most Christians as a punishment from God, because the king had disobeyed the orders of God, of God not to open that trunk. And then when they finally found the relics, they're like, oh, God has forgiven us. We now have the strength that we need to fight back against the Moors. So now we can understand how the military, religious, historic, and day-to-day reasons for understanding how the phenomenon of Santiago happens at the end of the world in a little area called Finisterre in Galicia, which called Finisterre means in Latin, end of the world. For the first centuries of the Camino, and here we have a map of the different routes of the Camino de Santiago, being the French way being the most popular. But the French way was really not the first one. It used to, people used to do the pilgrimage, basically in the north way, attached to the ocean. So in the first few centuries, the Camino ran much more to the north by the Atlantic Cantabric coast, because Muslims were so far north that they were worried about being attacked by them. And they were pretty deadly. And so they would walk as far north as they could so that they could avoid the incursions from the Muslims. The problem is that by walking so near the coast, they had another danger. They had the danger of the Vikings. And the Vikings were basically the ISIS of that time, if you would, right? Because they were constantly attacking people in the coast. They came down in southern Spain, even went as far up as Seville. They had settled in southern Italy as well. They were really, really brutal. So from the south, they had the attacks of the Muslims, but then also from the north, they had the concern of being attacked by the Vikings. So being a pilgrim was by no means an easy thing to do at the time. In 997, Almanzor attacks Santiago, and shortly after that he dies, and the Caliphate of Cordoba enters a very serious crisis. And then in 1031 the Caliphate is dissolved and Andalus enters a crisis. In 1085 soldiers of Alfonso VI enter Toledo, and the Christian borders start to go down. So now you can see how the Kingdom of Leon and the Reign of Pamplona start kind of pushing down, and the border of Al-Andalus is not as far north anymore. So for 300 years, as we said, Christians had barely been hanging on, and now in less than half a century, there was an enormous advance south. So let's talk about who the pilgrims were. Who were the pilgrims? Who were the people doing the Camino de Santiago? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well in our next lecture. But of course, we had Christian believers, but also people looking for forgiveness, right? It is documented, for instance, that in the 14th century, the sin of adultery could only be forgiven by kneeling at the tomb of Santiago. Oftentimes, they signed treaties whereby part of the treaty or part of the deal was that somebody had to do the Camino de Santiago. So, for instance, when Count of Flanders and the King of France signed the Treaty of Navidad in 1326, they agreed that 13 pilgrims would do the Camino de Santiago. So they were trying to make sure that basically the strength of the Camino would continue. But of course, not all pilgrims followed legal or religious reasons, right? Some wanted to do business, and the Camino basically becomes a great source for business there, and where a lot of money would come in. So the ideal of the picaros, or the rogues, was born. People trying to take advantage, right, of whatever was being given to the pilgrims. So, for instance, there were a number of hospitals. We're going to be talking more about that in our next lecture. But there were a number of hospitals that were built along the way to help the pilgrims that would get sick or injured along the way. So hospitals had to end up limiting to 3 days the number of days that the sick could receive care under very exceptional circumstances, right? Because otherwise rogues or picaros would basically take advantage of the hospitality of the hospitals along the way. Pilgrims were often asked to donate a day of labor to build, for instance, bridges or churches, etc. And some entire towns were actually built this way. A good example is the town of Santo Domingo de la Calzada was built almost entirely by pilgrims doing the Camino de Santiago. So the buildings, hospitals, churches, cemeteries, bridges, and even entire towns were basically built as a result. The Camino brings the best and the worst, and with believers and rogues living side by side in the Camino. So if it is hard to believe that Santiago preached in Spain, that he could come mysteriously on a boat all the way down from the Mediterranean up the coast of the Atlantic, blown by angels and buried in Spain, then who's buried there? Who's buried in the tomb of Santiago de Compostela? At the end of the 19th century, there's a very fierce debate that was opened by the French Louis Duchess when he publishes an article in the Annales de Midi that perhaps who's buried there is one of the first heretics of Christianity. Unamuno, who had been the rector of the University of Salamanca and a very famous philosopher, basically stated that all modern men gifted with a critical spirit cannot admit, no matter how Catholic, that the body of Santiago de Compostela is buried there. So there is, of course, the theory that the first heretic one of the first heretics of Christianity is buried there instead. And we're going to be talking more about him, of course, in our next lecture. But basically, it was said that it was Pristiliano, and Pristiliano was born in 340 and died in 385. He was the bishop of Avila in the 4th century, and he had trouble. He came from a family with means, and he had traveled all over Europe and had met Agape. You probably have heard of the Agape Church now, and other philosophers, and had learned a lot from them. And his ideas were really very different, right? Basically, his ideas had a lot of Celtic reminiscence. He gave women a huge role in the church, believing that they could perform the same duties as that of a priest and raising them to that level. He also believed that Mass could be celebrated anywhere because basically God was everywhere. And so he had a constant communion with nature. For him, his temple was nature. He also believed that he could use milk and grapes to celebrate Mass, that you don't need to use wine and bread necessarily. And so he would hold rituals outdoors to guarantee a harvest. He also defended the poverty against the wealth of the church, which of course really, really threatened the establishment at the time, as you can imagine. He definitely believed in the separation of church and state, which of course today we see that as a very normal thing, but back then they were very, very much together. And he was basically committed to a life of poverty and had a perfect communion with nature every time he was out there. And he was a hippie, basically, a hippie of the 4th century. Nature was for him the temple of God. And he also declared that priests were not needed, to interpret the Bible, that they were not needed as intermediaries at all. And many of his rituals could be considered modern, even for today's people. But of course, back then, the church felt very much threatened by him. And so Magno Clemente Maximo condemned him and 6 of his followers, which included a woman, for crimes of what was called black magic and obscene doctrines. He becomes that way the first martyr for a crime of opinion, and they cut his head and that of his 6 followers. His death did not kill what is called Priscillianismo or the Priscillian doctrines, and instead it just made it explode in popularity, right? They made him a martyr, and now his followers just basically took his doctrines and spread them as far as they could. After Maximo died, because Maximo had not granted permission to anybody to take his body, but after Magno Clemente Maximo, who was the one that had him killed, after he dies, permission is granted to take his body from Trevedes, where he had been killed. The documentation does not specify where he was given permission to be taken to. It just says that he was given permission to leave Trevedes. But, of course, he was from Iria Flavia, near Santiago de Compostela. He had a lot of followers there. And since he was from there, it was believed that he was taken to Iria Flavia when he died. So when the grave was found in the 9th century, the interesting thing about this fact is that they also found the body of a woman, which is really a big coincidence given that a woman was killed with Priscilliano as well, and that he would have been buried there. And let's remember that when Maximus died, they allowed his body to leave, and that most likely he had gone to Iria Flavia. He had been born in what was called Gaetia at the time, and because the Priscillianismo was so important, it was believed that his body was buried there. So there's really a very strong current of people that believe that probably the body that we see today in the coffin of Santiago de Compostela, there's a strong likelihood that it was that of Priscilliano and not of Santiago. But of course, those who believe Protestant Martin Luther believe that what is buried there are the bones of a dog. So there's really no way of knowing for sure. I wanted to give you a little bit of the different theories of who may be buried there. The truth of the matter is that all who have walked the Camino will say, whether they're believers or not, is that there is a before and an after having walked the Camino in their lives. It affects them that deeply. There's a review of your life in meditation, and you realize the things that you had given importance to, and the things that you had not given importance to that you should have. Let's talk for a moment. As we said we were going to do so at the beginning, we're going to talk about the symbol of the pilgrim, which is the scallop shell. The medieval Camino was built over a much, much older one, linked to the Celtic culture in northern Spain. And it could have also been the route of the Druids that did not stop in Santiago but continued on to the ocean to Mujia. And it would have made sense, right, that the pilgrimage should not stop in Santiago, would go on to the sea. After all, the symbol, and we're going to be talking about this in our next lecture as well. After all, the symbol of the pilgrim is, in fact, the shell. It was basically the way of the stars to arrive to the end of the world, to Finisterre, which is in the coast. And in fact, many pilgrims go to the coast today and burn their clothes there, kind of like for a new beginning. Let's talk about the origin of the idea of how this all started. The first example of the use of the shell appears at the beginning of the 12th century in the western gate of Autun, dedicated to the final judgment, and the shell appears above the pilgrims as a sign of resurrection. It also appears in the burial of a pilgrim in the year 1120. So this appears very early on in the pilgrimage, right? The shell also appears 3 times in the Codex Calixtinus. The Codex Calixtinus was the book that appeared in the 12th century, divided into 5 sections. This is a book we're going to be talking a lot in detail in our next lecture. And it's kept today in the Museum of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. Beautiful manuscript. And so, as we said, the shell, it's mentioned 3 times in the Codex. The first time, it's mentioned in the Sermon of Veranda, the first time it is mentioned in the Sermon of Venerada Dies. He describes the scallop shells, sculpted like hands, and upon returning, pilgrims would sew them onto their capes for the glory of the apostle. In the 5th book, they explain how shells are sold in the beginning, and they had to be real shells, and after the 12th century, reproductions in metal and in jet were sold just outside of the cathedral, which are still sold today, interestingly. And the third time that the shell is mentioned in the Codex Calixtinus, it's in the 2nd book, in a miracle that it's said about the night that the apostle cured of an illness when he basically touched the shell. Since the Codex since the Codex Calixtinus was a book that legitimizes the shells as a souvenir or symbol of the Camino, we basically owe it to Bishop Diego Gelmírez, who was the one that promoted the Calixtinus, the Codex Calixtinus, as a promoter, if not a creator of the symbol. And we're going to be talking a lot about Diego Gelmírez, Bishop Diego Gelmírez, in our next lecture. So, why the shell? Why did they pick the shell? The Liber Sancti Jacobi in Salamanca, it's an example of the iconography of the shell, with Santiago writing over a field of white shells. So you will see here on the right a copy of the page where it appears, and then I have enhanced it for you on the left so you can see. So you see basically Santiago Matamoros riding his white horse, and he has, of course, the shell on his flag, and then you see a field, a red field, probably red because of all the blood in the and it's already shown there. So very early on in the pilgrimage, the shell was used. In section 2 of the Tumbo B in the Cathedral of Santiago, which is from 1326, there is also an image of Santiago Matamoros with 3 shells killing Muslims. And basically it was described as the flag of Santiago that brings Christians to kill infidels. Crusaders would also have an importance in the development of the shell as generators of cultural exchange throughout the Middle Ages in Europe and the Middle East. They introduced Middle Eastern elements in the iconography of Europe, like the moon, for instance. And of course, they introduced the shell to the Middle East. You can see here their uniform with the cross of Santiago, and they would promote the shell and bring it to other parts of Europe and the Middle East as well. We have down below here on the left, rather in the right bottom part of this picture, we see the coin ceca compostelana, which was found in an archaeological dig in Santiago from the kingdom of Fernando II. And you can see basically a statue or the iconography of Santiago in the middle of the coin with 2 seashells in either side. Again, this is also from the 12th century. in the Casa de las Conchas in Salamanca, which was subsidized by Rodrigo Maldonado de Talavera, who was a knight of the Order of St. James and a professor of law at the University of Salamanca in the 15th century. He has this building erected next to the university and wants to honor basically wants to honor Santiago, and puts the shells all over the house. Who walks the Camino today? Let's talk about who's doing it each year, right? Mostly men, not by much, but about 138,929 people, or 52 or almost 53% are men. About 47% of the people that walk the Camino are women. Most people do it by foot, 90%, but almost 10% do it by bicycle, and a much smaller number, 0.29% by horse. And yes, some people do it by wheelchairs, 0.03%. A lot of famous people over the years have walked the Camino. I had the honor of having a very interesting conversation with my now friend Shirley MacLaine about the Camino. As you know, she too walked it and had a very spiritual experience, supposedly, to the point where she actually wrote a book called The Camino. And she sends her regards and wishes you buen camino as well. So the tomb has been open a number of times and different testing has been done, but the truth of the matter is there's no real proof of who is actually buried there. And with or without faith, we go back to the whole idea that the Camino started 1,200 years ago, and it's basically there, just as strong today as it was when it was discovered 1,200 years ago. And this, ladies and gentlemen, truly is remarkable. So, regardless of the reason why you're doing the Camino de Santiago, one basically has the time to meditate about the things that are important in our lives, right? And perhaps we had been giving importance to things that didn't have it, and perhaps we didn't give importance to the things that really did have it. So this is basically an interior Camino as much as it is an exterior Camino, a Camino in which we will be very different people when we finish it than we were from when we started it. Thank you very much.